What would you write if you knew you would die frozen, alone, at the end of the world? In the vast, silent whiteness of Antarctica, where even the wind seems to carry the weight of fate, a man pens his final words. His hand trembles not only from the cold, but from the brutal awareness that he will never see the sun again. His name was Robert Falcon Scott, and he was no ordinary man. He was the commander of one of the most ambitious expeditions of the early 20th century. But the letter he held was not a mere note. It was his testament, written on the brink of death, amid snow, darkness, and failure. Scott set out into the unknown with the promise of glory, leading his men like a British hero toward the South Pole. What he didn't know was that this epic journey would become a tragedy frozen in time. His final letter is not just a farewell record, it is the voice of someone who faced the impossible and lost, but lost with dignity, with courage, and with words that would echo through the centuries. The world was in a moment of quiet but fierce competition. It was the early 20th century, and the last great unexplored territory on Earth drew the attention of the greatest powers, the icy, inhospitable Antarctica. The race to the South Pole had become a symbol of national prestige. Being the first to plant a flag at that remote point meant more than geographic conquest. It was a moral, scientific, and political victory. In this context, Robert Falcon Scott, an officer of the British Royal Navy, took command of the Terra Nova expedition in 1910. With it, he carried not only supplies and brave men, but also the hopes of an entire empire. The mission was twofold: reach the South Pole and conduct cutting-edge scientific research. Yet reality soon took hold. Biting winds, temperatures below 40 degrees C, treacherous terrain, and dwindling supplies would prove as deadly as any army. Scott's journey was grand and at the same time suicidal. Perhaps he knew it, but driven by the Victorian spirit of honor and sacrifice, he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the endless white horizon. Each step on the ice was a page written in British history, a story that, as we will soon see, would end in painfully poetic tragedy. After months of facing the impossible, crossing fields of jagged ice, hauling sleds without the aid of dogs, and pushing the limits of the human body, Scott and his companions finally sighted their goal, the South Pole. It was January 1912, and the white horizon seemed for a moment to promise victory. But upon reaching the exact spot, the silence of the snow was shattered by something devastating. A flag. Not the United Kingdom's, but Norway's. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, had arrived there a month earlier. Scott's dream of being the first vanished in seconds. The tent set up by Amundsen still stood, like a trophy left by a silent victor. The frustration was crushing. All they had sacrificed, time, health, energy, was now merely a footnote in the history of polar exploration. But they still had one challenge: to return. With their bodies already worn and morale shattered, the mission to survive remained. And that, unfortunately, would be even more brutal than the journey there. The return, which should have been merely a cautious descent to the starting point, turned into a labyrinth of suffering. The cold now felt more cruel, as if Antarctica itself were punishing the audacity of those who dared to challenge it. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable levels, below 40 degrees C. The ice became blades under weary feet, and the wind a constant scream in their ears. One by one, the team members began to succumb. The first was Edgar Evans, who suffered a fall, injuries, and died days later. The second was Lawrence Oates, whose frostbitten feet had turned gangrenous. Realizing he was a burden to the others, he left the tent during a blizzard, saying only, "I'm just stepping outside for a bit." He was never seen again. The three remaining, Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers, were trapped inside a tent, surrounded by an endless snowstorm, without strength, without food, without salvation. There, isolated from the world, with no hope left, they began to write. With hands scarred by frost and eyes slowly fading, they turned their final hours into words that would endure for generations. It was the beginning of their final letters, a farewell written in the white silence of Antarctica. Inside the snow-covered tent, where time seemed to have frozen along with their bodies, Robert Falcon Scott took paper and pen. The end was inevitable, but even facing death, he did not choose silence. He chose to write. His letters were not mere farewells. They were quiet, courageous cries addressed to those still alive. He wrote to his wife, Kathleen, with a tenderness that pierces the heart. "You have been everything I could ever wish for." He asked that their young son be cared for. "Make him a good man, a noble man." With each sentence, the strength of a father shone through, one who wanted to leave more than a frozen body. He wanted to leave a memory that would guide, protect, and love. But Scott also wrote to the British government and the public. He explained they had tried everything, that there was no mistake, only an unforgiving fate. In one of the most poignant passages, he confessed, "We fought to the end, but we could not succeed." Even in the face of utter defeat, his voice was steady, his handwriting proud. It was as if, with each letter, he refused to die in vain. The words Scott left behind are not merely a record of tragedy. They are a mirror of the soul of a man who, even surrounded by death, refused to lose his dignity. His letters reveal not despair, but full awareness. He knew he would not return, yet he wanted the world to understand why and how they perished. It is impossible to read those lines without feeling the weight of each choice. Scott could have used his last strength to rage, curse fate, or simply weep. Instead, he chose honor, legacy, and even hope. He spoke of love for his family, pride in his team, and the certainty that their sacrifice would hold some value. The letter transforms Scott's image. He is not just the commander of a failed mission. He is the symbol of a generation that believed glory lay not in success, but in the way one fought. His words transcend time, turning defeat into an eternal act of courage. Reading that letter is like hearing the whisper of a spirit unbroken by the cold, but immortalized by its inner strength. Months after Scott's final diary entry, a search team from the Terra Nova expedition found the tent, almost entirely buried in snow. Inside, 3 bodies lay side by side, a notebook beside Scott, and with it, a bundle of letters carefully protected. Those fragile papers, stained by time and ice, held not only a man's final words, but a message that would move an entire empire. When the letters reached England and were made public, they caused a stir. It was no longer just a failed mission. It was a story of sacrifice, bravery, and humanity in the face of the abyss. The public saw not defeated men, but tragic heroes. Robert Falcon Scott's image was immortalized as that of a modern martyr, someone who, despite failing in his goal, triumphed in the heart of a nation. The letters became symbols of patriotism, courage, and honor. They inspired books, statues, documentaries, and above all, they showed how written truth, even in final moments, can achieve an eternity the body cannot. Robert Falcon Scott's letter is not just a farewell, it is a reminder that even in the icy silence of the world's end, words still hold power. They cross time, tear through oblivion, and touch us with a force that death cannot silence. Scott's courage lies not only in the steps he took on the ice, but in the pen he held when hope was gone. As the cold extinguished the life in his body, he wrote with clarity and grandeur. Not to be remembered as a hero, but to ensure his story, and that of his companions, would not be buried in oblivion. And so, that letter turned failure into eternity. Because sometimes what truly survives is not victory, but the courage of those who fell fighting. If this story touched you, imagine how many others lie forgotten, dormant in letters lost to time, abandoned manuscripts, undelivered notes, unread diaries, all waiting to be heard. In the silence of yellowed paper, there are voices still whispering profound truths. Subscribe to the Lost Letters channel, where words echo beyond death. Leave a like if this letter moved you, and comment below, did you already know this story? Which letter do you think deserves to be unearthed in the next episode? Because sometimes, a simple piece of paper is all that remains to remind the world of a soul that refused to be forgotten.